Hello, Spring Spanish community, welcome. So today we have a special guest. I'm going to be talking to Luca Lampariello. He is a polyglot. He speaks 14 languages, Spanish among them, obviously. We're going to be responding to different questions and we're going to be giving examples about the language learning process. The first and the last questions are going to be in Spanish, so you may rely on the subtitles for translation. Now, you should also know that this is the first part of this collaboration. The second part you may find on Luca's channel, which, by the way, was awarded Best Language Learning YouTube channel by BuzzFeed. So definitely check it out when you can. I'm going to leave the link to the second part of this collaboration in the description box below. Now, I want to really thank Luca for being here, and let's get this going.
How to get a good accent in Spanish. ¿Cómo lograr un buen acento en español?
Para mí, tener un buen acento es más una cuestión psicológica que de habilidad lingüística. Mucha gente dice, por ejemplo, esta persona tiene una muy buena pronunciación porque tiene un talento, tiene un oído excepcional. Yo pienso que no es verdad, no es cierto. Para mí, en mi caso, y no solo en mi caso, pienso que se trata más de adaptarse y querer adaptarse a otra cultura, abrazar otra manera de pensar y otra manera de hablar. Entonces, para mí, lo más importante es una cuestión psicológica. Me acuerdo de cuando empecé a aprender inglés americano, quería ser como un americano. No era simplemente una cuestión de hablar como un americano, sino de actuar y de ser como un americano. Y segundo, que para mí es súper importante, es que te das cuenta que en las escuelas en general no se aprende la gramática, nos dan muchas nociones y información sobre reglas gramaticales, pero la verdad es que nunca recibimos un entrenamiento de fonética, un entrenamiento fonético de cómo se pronuncian los sonidos, de cómo se habla en general, de cómo se forman las frases desde un punto de vista fonético. Empieza desde el principio, porque nosotros como seres humanos, nuestro cerebro es muy bueno para aprender, pero la verdad es que no es muy bueno para desaprender. Y una vez que tengamos esos patrones fonéticos ya en nuestra cabeza, a lo mejor porque has aprendido un idioma y ya lo hablas desde 10 años, es muy difícil cambiar tus patrones, cambiar la manera de pronunciar, así que mejor empezar desde el principio. Estas son las dos cosas más importantes, entonces digamos una actitud psicológica y empezar desde el principio, porque la verdad es que se puede y puedes empezar con un entrenamiento bueno, efectivo y con los recursos que tenemos, Spring Spanish y muchos otros recursos que tenemos en internet, todo es posible ahora.
Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con el hecho de que hay que trabajar la pronunciación desde el principio. De otra manera, se pueden adquirir hábitos que es más difícil cambiar o corregir más adelante. Si nos pensamos como un lienzo en blanco, el proceso se vuelve mucho más sencillo. Muchas personas se sienten extrañas o avergonzadas cuando tienen una buena pronunciación porque les parece que se están saliendo de ese personaje que pertenece a su lengua materna. Definitivamente puede sonar o incluso sentirse extraño al principio, pero hay que pensarlo como que estamos asumiendo un nuevo papel, como un personaje completamente nuevo en esa lengua extranjera que estamos aprendiendo.
What to do about grammar?
You learn grammar through language and not the other way around, said famed Kato Lomb, Hungarian polyglot once, and when I read the sentence, this has stuck with me ever since. And the reason why it has stuck with me ever since is because it is so true. I've been learning a lot of languages and I figured out that the best way is to get grammar rules, grammar patterns from language. So the first piece of advice is to read and listen to stuff as much as you can. And that stuff should be comprehensible and should be fun, because if you get exposed yourself, if you get massive exposure to the language, you're going to figure out the patterns, and your brain is going to do that for you. Now, this does not mean that you do not have to open a grammar book. My piece of advice is get massive input, get massive exposure to the language for some time, can be 3 months to 6 months, and then you can take a peek at some grammar books, and you will see that you're going to understand these grammar rules much better at that point than you would have if you had started from the very beginning. So the basic rule is 80% exposure, 20% some grammar drills, but do that after you get massive exposure for at least a few months.
Exactly this. Most people start the other way around, so they start learning grammar rules and vocab lists, but the best way is to just get immersed in the language, read a lot, listen to the language a lot, even if you don't understand most of it, because that way your brain will get used to the patterns. And once that has happened, then you can just go to that grammar book, read about the rules, but then it'll be easier to understand them because your brain is already used to those patterns. So your brain already knows them, and reading the rules is just going to be a confirmation of those rules you've been exposed to before in a context where the language is actually being used.
Most important daily activities.
When it comes to daily activities, I think that for beginners, it's really important to stick to short dialogues or short stories that have audio and script so that you can listen to the language and you can also read it. And it's very important to do both. That should be the base. Get exposure to authentic, interesting, comprehensible content from the very beginning. If though you have a higher level, for example, you are an intermediate learner, you can venture into longer text that you can find on the internet. Maybe you can download a Wikipedia article, or you can just listen to longer podcasts and with longer scripts. One more thing I wanted to add, if you have reached an intermediate level, it would be cool to speak maybe once or twice a week, speaking with your tutor or a language partner, because if you want to speak a language, you have to speak, and at least a couple of times a week would be great on top of exposing yourself to authentic content. So remember, listening and reading should be the base every single day, and on top of that, the cherry on top would be speaking a couple of times a week with a language partner and talking about topics you love talking about.
Like Luca said, from the very beginning, start by listening Spanish in actual conversations. So the best way is through dialogues or books where there's a parallel translation, because again, that's when it's going to click and you're going to say, oh, so that's how you say it in this particular language. On top of that, you should try to listen to music, podcasts, so anything you can get your hands on. The point is that your brain gets used to the language. And if you're at a more advanced level, then you should try to just get as much input as possible, because there will be a point where speaking, you're gonna have to use the language at some point. All the Spanish or the language you've absorbed by listening to music and reading and podcasts and watching series and stuff is just going to roll off your tongue, because your brain's going to be just so used to the language that you're not going to find it that hard. In addition to that, if you have been constant and have been, forcing yourself to use the language and to make it necessary in your everyday life, then it's going to be way easier. You could even try to have a conversation with yourself, like going through your day in the language, so that you're actually using it in addition to all the immersion you have had with the material we've mentioned, like music and podcasts and stuff.
What to do about mistakes?
I honestly think the mistakes are actually the best friends we have in the path of language learning. We come from a system, and I think no matter where you come from in the world, where we tend to stigmatize mistakes. There's this social stigma to mistakes that make us It makes us afraid of making mistakes, and it makes it easy for us to criticize others when they make mistakes. And I think everybody else has to think and change the mentality and the approach we have towards making mistakes when it comes to language learning and making mistakes in life. If you change that, everything changes. So remember, there's 3 things you need to do. You have to change your mindset, because that is going to change everything, and you have to celebrate mistakes. Every time you make a mistake, pat yourself on the back and say, I have learned something instead of I have failed. That makes a huge difference. They say that 10% is what happens to your life and 90% is how you react to it. And that is very true when it comes to making mistakes. The second thing is, if you're not afraid of making mistakes anymore, then you will go and get out of your comfort zone. Get out of your comfort zone as soon as possible. When it comes to speaking Spanish, getting out of your comfort zone means talking about stuff you haven't talked about before, talking about stuff you've talked about before, but in a different way. Venture into conjugating verbs in a way you've never conjugated before, and do all sorts of things that you're a little bit scared of doing, but that you should do if you want to take Spanish to the next level. And the third thing is learn from your mistakes. And learning from your mistakes means that when someone corrects you and you have a positive mindset, maybe you're going to scribble down and jot down that mistake, or maybe make a collection, a notebook of all the mistakes you make, and you'll learn from that, because that's how we improve. We make mistakes, someone corrects us, we take it in, we just take it in, we absorb it, and we try again. That's how it works, trial and error. But for the life of you, remember, mistakes are not your enemies, they are your best friends. Get into a positive mindset, embrace them, and your language learning path will become brighter and brighter.
Mistakes are inevitable when learning a language. They will happen and you will learn a lot from them, because actually the more embarrassing the mistake is, the higher the chances you're never going to make that mistake again, because we all want to avoid embarrassment, right? Making mistakes is absolutely the best way to learn the language. And actually, if you learn Spanish, for instance, through the chunking method we use at Spring Spanish, the likelihood of you making mistakes is going to be less, because you're actually going to learn the language in context, and that reduces the chances of error.
Memory, memorization.
Memory is like a muscle. You have to train it in order for it to get bigger and better. We cannot see actually what is happening in our head, but it actually pretty much works like lifting weights and getting your muscles stronger. But you have to know how to do it. The human brain tends to forget stuff, so you want to feed it the right way so that it remembers. Now, in terms of memory, it's really important to design a system that is fun and that is brain friendly. In the case of language learning and the famous vocab acquisition or memorization, a lot of people complain that they try to learn a mass of words, a lot of words, but they can't, and they keep forgetting them. Again, this is obvious and very natural, because that's how our brain works. It discards stuff that it doesn't like and keeps stuff that it likes. So in terms of vocab, here's my piece of advice. Actually, there's a couple of pieces of advice. First thing, focus on the essential stuff that is essential for you. An example, how do you say, I want to live in Spain, I want to live in Mexico. I want and live are essential verbs that you need for communication. And then focus on the stuff that you like. So things you need and things you like, because remember, the brain, regardless of what you think, will discard the stuff that is not necessary and that is not fun. That's the very first thing. The second piece of advice that is really important is focus on sentences, and sentences in context. That is really important. We learn in chunks. Chunking is very important, not only to remember phone numbers, to remember other things, it's also to remember words. So always work in sentences. Make your sentences short, memorable, personal, and fun, so that you can remember them better. And when it comes to creating sentences, I mean that you first expose yourself to a lot of stuff, a lot of interesting stories, a lot of interesting dialogues. Then you can extract these interesting sentences, the sentences you like, and also make sentences you can create that are personal to you, and then maybe put them into a space. It can be a notebook, it can be a Google Excel, it can be a Google Doc, it doesn't matter, but make sure that you work in sentences. And the third piece of advice is use this stuff. Use them in a conversation, but you don't need human beings to use these sentences. You can, you need a human being yourself. So if you don't have people to talk to, yet you can still talk to yourself. This is what I do all the time. I use my tiny little cute notebooks where I put all these sentences that I like, that I've taken from context or that I have created, and I use them to have conversations with myself. Some people think I'm a little bit crazy if they see me talking to myself, but I can assure you that this works and makes words stick. You have to see them like a big network, because the brain works according to some association principle, and they're all are, embedded in our head. So use your brain in a brain-friendly way, and you will see that words are not going to be that difficult to remember. Actually, it's going to be fun.
Try to always learn as much context as possible. The more hooks you have, you give your brain, the better, because it's easier. Our brains work better when there's a narrative, when there's a story. So it's easier for us to remember a fairy tale we heard many times when we were children than, like hard data from a geography book that we just spent a whole night cramming into our brain before the test. So it's easier for us to remember the story because there's a storyline rather than just the data in isolation. Therefore, it's better to learn words in context than in isolation. And in addition to learning chunks in context, like we've said many times, repetition is also very important. So make sure that whatever it is you learned during a day, that you practice it and do you repeat it regularly so that your brain gets used to it and so that your brain doesn't forget it. Flashcard apps are very good at helping us in doing this. So some of them are Anki and Brainscape. But remember that regardless if you use flashcards or flashcard apps, the important is that you practice regularly. That's the most important part, that you learn in context all the time, never in isolation.
Funny situations in Spanish. Situaciones graciosas que te sucedieron con el español.
El italiano y el español son primos, pero no son hermanos gemelos, así que hay naturalmente diferencias. Y es divertido porque un montón de italianos piensan, por ejemplo, que hablar español simplemente es añadir unas cuantas S al final de las palabras, ¿no? Tenía un amigo cuando vivía en Barcelona que vino a Barcelona y preguntaba, por ejemplo, en los bares, ¿posos haberes un cafés por favores? o algo así. Y claro, los españoles en general es gente muy agradable, así que respondía con ironía, digamos. Y en cuanto a mí, lo que me pasó es que no me pasa todavía a veces, es que en español hay falsos amigos. O sea, hay palabras que uno piensa, ok, es igual, pero significan en los dos idiomas dos cosas diferentes. Por ejemplo, una vez estaba hablando con mi compañero de piso barcelonés, que es de Barcelona, y le decía, quiero mear, y le decía, quiero pisar. Y él me dice, ¿quieres pisar? ¿Quieres pisar? Yo, quiero pisar, pero ¿dónde? Y no nos entendíamos. Al final entendí que pisar en español es algo muy diferente. En italiano es pisare, que es mear. Y yo quería simplemente decir, quiero mear. Así que pisar es otra cosa, ¿no? Pisar el césped en español. Y estas cosas pasan a menudo porque en español y en italiano hay un montón de palabras, los falsos amigos, que son parecidas, pero que no significan lo mismo, a veces cosas completamente diferentes. Y estas cosas han pasado un montón de veces y esta es una de las razones por las cuales el español me encanta y es espectacular.
A mí me pasó algo similar, pero en inglés. Fue una situación bastante vergonzosa. Iba con una amiga canadiense en un autobús a Praga. Por alguna razón que no recuerdo cuál fue, empezamos a hablar de enfermedades. Y en español, cuando tenemos la nariz tapada así por gripe o resfriado, decimos estoy constipada o constipado. Entonces cuando dije constipated, mi amiga me volteó a ver así como me dijo, creo que no es eso lo que quieres decir. Porque claro, constipated no tiene que ver con la nariz, sino con los intestinos. Entonces, volviendo al tema de los errores, ese error en particular me hizo entender que pues justo se trataba de un falso amigo y no volví a cometer ese error nunca más en la vida. I want to thank Maria Fernanda for hosting this video. Okay, so thank you very much to Luca for being here and for sharing all those tips and tricks, for letting us know how the mind of a polyglot works. And I hope this information is useful to you all. Don't forget to check out the other part of this collaboration. The link is here below, so check it out whenever you can. Thank you for watching and nos vemos. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and share this video with your friends.